Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Mauricio, and I am here with Emilia, who will be cooking today. We are both a part of 18 Reasons, which is a nonprofit cooking school, and our mission is to empower our community with both the confidence and the creativity needed to buy, cook, and eat good food every day. Thank you all so much for joining the class today, being open to online learning, and yeah, if you're by any chance if you're going to be cooking with us, for welcoming us into your homes and your kitchen. Yeah, so today we're having another food pantry demo class. So we will be using ingredients from the food pharmacy food pantry in downtown Oakland. So yeah, Emilia will be demonstrating how to make a meal out of the different ingredients that we're given. So today we are actually making fidels with chicken and greens. So I'll leave you off to Emilia. I'll be here if you have any question at all. You can put that into the chat. I'll be watching it, and I can let Emilia know if anything pops up. But yeah, we could go ahead and get started with cooking, Emilia.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. Like he said, I'm Amelia. I'm also with 18 Reasons, and we're going to be cooking together today. So I don't know about you all, but I was so stoked when I got my pantry box. There were so many good things and basically infinite possibilities. We're going to be making some fideos today, which is basically a tomatoey braised chicken and noodle dish. Very comforting, very tasty, but infinitely variable. So depending on what you got in your box, depending on what you get from the grocery store each week, you can really do a lot with it, which are my favorite kind of recipes. So let's get started. We're going to use up those chicken drumsticks first. For this recipe, you could use any sort of chicken. You need about a pound, and ideally you want bone-in with skin, because we're going to render some of the fat from that skin to flavor everything, and the bone inside makes the flavors of the dish really come together and taste extra chickeny. So it was perfect that in our boxes this week we got some drumsticks. Here are the drumsticks here, and the most important part to making any dish delicious is seasoning along the way. So before we start to cook this chicken, we're going to season it. The base flavor of this dish is going to be smoked paprika. So first, we're going to add some salt to our chicken. Make it rain. Don't want to be too scarce with it here, because the chicken is going to be added to all sorts of other things, which means that this salt is going to flavor the whole dish. It's not just going to flavor the chicken, so you can be generous. I'm also adding about a tablespoon of paprika, a little more salt for the bottom dudes. And like I said, you could also use chicken thighs. Chicken thighs or drumsticks are probably my favorite cut, just because they're so flavorful. They're more a higher concentration of muscle, basically. So they have a little more oomph to them, and that means you can cook them for longer, and they just get more succulent, more juicy, and flavorful. So while I season those, I'm just going to start preheating my pan over medium-high heat. We're going to build flavors in a couple different ways here. So first of all, we're seasoning our chicken. I'm going to rub this salt and paprika all over. So we're building flavor by first seasoning our chicken. We're going to sear our chicken, which is not a totally essential step, but will pay dividends later on, because when we sear it, we render some of the fat from the skin, like I had said. You also create some browning. So this dish will have a lot of liquid in the form of tomatoes and chicken broth or water. So when you start by searing, you crisp up the skin a bit, you get some browning, and browning is flavor. Mauricio, you should count how many times I say flavor.
I'll definitely make a note of it. Yeah, but definitely browning definitely gives off a lot of flavor. Definitely, basically gets the best out of your food. So it's always good to do while you're cooking.
One thing I'll often do too, which you'll see later how much fat we render from the skin. Sometimes I'll save the chicken fat and use that in other dishes. So meat can sometimes be really expensive, but in order to stretch it and get all of the bang for our buck, I'll save the rendered chicken fat and add that to all sorts of other things, whether you're frying eggs or, frying rice. You can basically just use it like another form of oil, except that it'll have that chickeny succulence. Okay, so you can see my chicken all ready. I'm going to wash my hands, then we're going to start searing.
And also, just a reminder, the recipe for today is in the link in the description in that Google Drive link. And you could go ahead and click on that, and it'll take you to where we have the folder where we have all of our recipes. And then you could find our recipe from last week, the last month, the jambalaya, and then you can find this recipe as well for your reference. So I know Amelia will be talking about a lot of things today, but if you want it all written in paper, it's okay.
Yeah, and we'd love to hear what you all are making with your boxes too, because we all know there's way more than one dish worth of ingredients in there. So I'm sure you all have gotten creative. I'm adding just a little bit of neutral oil to the bottom of my pan. This kind of gets it started. As soon as I add the chicken, might splatter a bit. The way you know your pan is hot is when the oil runs really smoothly across the surface, more like water than like syrup. Because at the beginning, it's really thick. When it heats up, it gets thinner.
And you mentioned we have the pan at
Yeah, so depending on your stove, you can toggle it, but starting at medium high is a good move just so you start the cooking pretty quickly. So I added mine. It wasn't quite sizzling in the way that I wanted it to. So before I add the others, I'm going to let that first one start sizzling, and then I'll know that it's hot enough to add the rest. It's good to use a number of indicators to know whether your pan is hot. So, like I said, you can check the oil. You can also hover your hand high above it and see if you can feel the heat. Then the ultimate test is whether your food cooks like you want it to. So mine was a little cooler than I wanted, so we're just waiting another second or two. And in this first phase, we're not going to cook the chicken thoroughly. We're just going to get that browning, and then later we're going to put our chicken into the oven, and that will be the final cooking. So at the end of the second phase in the oven is when we want it to reach a proper temperature, ideally about 175 for chicken thighs or drumsticks. But at this point, it's not going to be cooked through to the middle. We're just going to get it brown on the outside.
I hear that pan starting sizzle.
Yeah, isn't it a great noise? It's very soothing.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, now that's a lot louder.
Yeah, it's like some people listen to like white noise to fall asleep. I feel like I could listen to this.
This should be a thing, right?
And I'm putting them in skin side down because the skin is what we want to make contact with the pan. Okay, it is on its way. And you'll notice I have a stainless steel pan here. This will be nice because you'll be able to see the browning that happens, and we can start to build our dish in here. This pan has plastic on the handle, so it can't go into the oven, which means that I'll transfer all of the ingredients from here to an oven-safe dish before we do the final phase of cooking. And now is a great time to mention my oven is preheated to 400 degrees.
And so right now what we're doing, Emilia, is just waiting until you brown like 2 sides of that chicken, right?
Yeah, about 2 sides. If you're really patient, you could brown more, but really we just want some of the browning to start happening. And then we're going to use the juice from the onion, garlic, tomatoes to scrape up all of that flavor from the bottom. And see, when I go to move this, it's still stuck to the bottom. That means it needs a little bit longer. This is true of all sorts of proteins. When it's ready to flip, it'll flip easily. So whether you're making fish, steak, hamburgers, if you have your pan hot enough, whenever you add it to the pan and it's ready to flip, it'll release easily when you try to move it.
So sticking on.
Yep. So we're on our way, but we're not quite there yet. As this happens, oh, what was that, Mauricio?
Oh no, I was just gonna mention how that's definitely another good indicator to use. It's not an indicator that I was aware of, but yeah, definitely, I'll definitely use it the next time I'm cooking any type of protein. So yeah, it's a like you said, it's definitely great to have like many different indicators and kind of just have different ways to tell that something's ready.
Absolutely. And when you're making meat, the best indicator is a thermometer. So if you have a thermometer, you should make use of it. If you don't have one, you can get them for very cheap, and it takes the guesswork out of it. So at the end, when our dish is done, we'll know because the top of the dish will be a little bit more dry, and we'll talk about that more later. But the chicken will have an internal temp of at least 165 and ideally around 175. The reason we go a bit higher with chicken thighs or with the dark meat, like these drumsticks, is because they have more stronger proteins in them. And the longer they cook, the more the like collagen and other elements break down, which makes them more tender and more delicious, which is nice. And you don't know that unless you take the temperature.
It's always great to be 100% sure, especially with chicken, that if you don't cook it thoroughly, it could, cause some problems. So we just want to make sure to have it well cooked.
Yes, I'm going to check my chicken once more. Still sticking a bit. As soon as it releases, I will give you a peek. But in the meantime, let's prep some of our other ingredients. The other ingredients on the recipe are spaghetti, which we got multiple packages in the box this week. This is whole wheat spaghetti, which is going to be really nice in this dish because it'll be a little bit chewier, which is the texture that I really enjoy. But you could certainly use white spaghetti, just white wheat spaghetti as well. We also have onion, garlic. The recipe calls for crushed tomatoes or tomato sauce. So right here we have the pasta sauce from the kit. If you're ever curious as to what is in your pasta sauce or tomato sauce, you can always just look at the ingredient list. So I know this doesn't just say plain tomatoes. It might make you think that you can only use it on pasta. Sure, we have some pasta in this dish, but you can really flavor it however you would like. If you look at the ingredients, it's primarily tomato puree, and then it has a few spices like salt. It has some carrot in it and some other ingredients, but they don't add additional flavor. So really, this is a pretty blank canvas as far as I'm concerned, which we'll be flavoring with the chicken, with the paprika, and the chicken broth. So that's another one of our ingredients. We also have some chicken broth, which came in our kit, but you could certainly use water if you don't have chicken broth. And we have all of these beautiful, beautiful mustard greens, which we'll be using shortly. But that covers it. I like adding lemon at the end, just for a bit of acidity. It brightens everything up. But again, totally optional. If you have lime, that would also be really delicious. But let's check that chicken. There we go. So it's releasing. It's releasing. You can see some browning happening there. The skin is turning more opaque, and there's more oil in the bottom of my pan than there was to begin with, which indicates that that skin is starting to render some of the fat. What rendering the fat means is that we're basically melting that skin down a little bit into liquid form. So chicken fat is called schmaltz generally. Bacon fat is called lard, or sorry, I guess pork fat generally is called lard. Those add so much flavor and they work just like using neutral oils. So we're taking advantage of the fat in the skin to cook the rest of the ingredients once they go in. Ooh, and it's a little bit crispy too. That's what we're looking for. You can see all of the browning happening there. Now that we have one side browned, we can give the other side a few minutes, but we don't necessarily have to achieve the same level of browning just because the other side is going to be nestled under the tomatoey liquid anyway. So we're going to lose some of the crunch on it. Whereas the top, we're going to leave that exposed so it'll stay crispy and it might even increase in browning. I'm going to grab a plate, and as soon as that chicken is done, I'll remove that to the plate so you can start adding other ingredients.
Yeah, kind of just a reminder of what Emilia went over. She heated up the Pantry medium. She added the chicken. Turkey added some toast to the bottom. Then she added her chicken skin tied down, and then she let it brown. The time depends. Emilia used the indicator of that kind of the chicken kind of coming off easily. So if it kind of still sticks to your pan, leave it there for a couple more minutes until it kind of comes off a lot more easier. So again, you can use that as an indicator. And now she just flipped it, and now she's just waiting for the other side not to necessarily achieve that same level of browning, but again, just to have it. Just to achieve some level of browning. It does not have to be like the same because, as she mentioned, one of the sides is going to be side down when it gets mixed with everything else. So, yeah, that chicken's looking good. I mean, we're starting to put that onto the plate.
Yep, so the second side browns even a little more quickly just because there's a little more oil in the pan and the pan is hotter at this point. So just like the second or third batch of pancakes cooks more quickly than the first, Exactly the same with our chicken. The second side usually browns a little more quickly than the first. And I turned my pan off just because it'll take us a minute to prepare the other ingredients before they go in, but we're not going to clean it off. We're going to take advantage of the flavor that we developed down there. And we're going to scrape it off with the liquid from the onions and the tomatoes. So here's my chicken. Looks all brown, already looking scrumptious. And a reminder that we did not cook this all the way through because we're going to be cooking it in the oven a little bit later. So the inside is still raw here, and that's totally fine because we're going to do a secondary level of cooking. Okay, let me set this down and we'll move on to the next step. So we started with our chicken and now we're going to move into our veggies. I have a big onion. If you had a smaller onion, then you could maybe use 2, but I really like the flavor that onions provide. Garlic too, of course. But I think the onions develop almost kind of a sweetness, which is nice because the rest of it is so savory. So when I go to prepare an onion, regardless of how I'm going to slice it, dice it, what have you, I always cut it in half because round objects are a lot scarier and harder to cut than objects with flat surfaces. So we cut our onion in half just so we have some flat surfaces. It doesn't roll away, doesn't try to make a break for it. Then to peel our onion super easily, we just cut a bit of the top off. Just like that. You can go at an angle so you don't take too much onion with you. Then once you cut the top off, you can just peel. Today, we're actually going to be using a grater. The reason we use the grater is because it's going to get some of the onion, it's going to make the onion a bit more juicy than if we were to dice it or slice it. And when we grate it, we're going to use that juice to scrape the browning from the bottom of the pan. So this is a good trick to use if you're looking for a bit more of that liquid. Otherwise, if you don't have a grater, dicing it or slicing it works just as well. We're just taking advantage of the flavor that the onion provides.
And then maybe I see that you're using the out of the grater that's usually used for cheese as well, right?
Exactly. I'm using the bigger holes. And also, because we're all friends here, I'll let you know, I'm probably going to cry. When you grate it, it gets, those onion vapors are especially strong. So if you have any goggles handy, it's a good opportunity to take advantage.
It's not like me, you're just going to have to cry it out.
I know, but then I'd have to double glasses because I have my glasses and I'd have throw some goggles on over it.
Right?
People get creative. I'm not sure what methods actually work besides contacts, which is what I usually wear and should have today. So you can see this onion is like pulpy almost. So it's like if you were to get a can of crushed tomatoes, it has a very similar texture actually. And I'm just cutting it in quarters so it's a little easier to manage as we get down to the end.
And are we going to use the whole onion, Amelia, or just parts of it?
I have kind of a massive onion, not to brag. So I'm going to use half of it.
And also, are we going to do the same thing? Are we also going to grate garlic as well?
Yeah, we are. And if we had fresh tomatoes rather than canned, I typically have canned tomatoes on hand just because they don't go bad as easily and they're just as nutritional as fresh tomatoes. But if you did have fresh tomatoes, I'd also recommend grating those. This is actually a really common method in a lot of Spanish food, is grating it, just because it creates that base and it's all an even texture from the beginning. Mauricio, can you tell us a bit about canned tomatoes versus fresh tomatoes, or any other vegetable for that matter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, canned vegetables and as I mentioned, tomatoes. They have the same amount of nutritional value as as fresh vegetables. So any other fresh vegetable also it has like the same nutritional value. Just that again, it could be a lot more convenient to have it canned sometimes because sometimes it might not be in season. It might not be as good as when it is in season, or sometimes it might be a little bit more expensive. So again, that I think that is like the only difference. Just sometimes when it is canned, it may also have some preservatives, but again, like in many of those cases, you could also rinse that all off. Yeah, you could basically rinse that off and just make sure that you wash that all off. But yeah, essentially that is, I feel that canned vegetables, fruits, and whatnot, they really have a bad rep. But in reality, it could be more advantageous sometimes compared to fresh produce. So definitely something that if you don't use as much because you think it isn't as healthy, it's definitely something that you should give a try. Especially considering some of the factors I just talked about.
Yeah, thank you, Mauricio. I know that I really love having canned or even frozen vegetables on hand because it means even if I don't make it to the grocery store, I'm too busy or whatever, I always have some vegetables to supplement whatever I'm making with. And when you get to the end and your fingers get close to the grater, stop grating. There's no reason to sacrifice your fingers for a little bit of onion. So when I got to that point, I stopped, and I'm just going to run through and finally mince it so it's about uniform with the rest of the onion. And you'll notice when I'm cutting, I hold my hands in a very specific way. I have my left hand in a claw to protect my fingers, because if your fingers are tucked, then they're safer from your blade. With my knife, I pinch the blade and I wrap my fingers around the handle just so I have ultimate control. Then as we cut, you want to move in a rocking motion, because regardless of what your knife looks like, they all have little teeth, which means they work more like a saw than they do an axe. And if I were using this like an axe, I would be going up and down, but instead we go back and forth, just like if we were using a saw to saw a tree down.
Yeah, and that's very useful for just making sure that there's no huge pieces of onion. No one really wants to like bite into something and so there's like a huge piece of onion in there. So yeah, just mincing is also like a great strategy to have everything nice and small, nice and even as well.
Yeah, totally. Because sometimes the texture might be less appealing for some folks, but I promise the flavor once it's cooked is so yummy and very appealing. So if texture is the issue, then you have so many ways of getting around that. Okay, I'm going to do the garlic real quick, and then we're going to throw that into the pan to start cooking. Honestly, unpopular opinion, but I think that onion might be my favorite vegetable. It's so versatile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like you can use it in so many foods just to give it that flavor. You know that onion always adds some flavor to your food.
It always adds flavor. I personally love it raw. I love it pickled, cooked, caramelized. So depending on what you're looking for, it can add spice, it can add sweetness. Today, because we're going to cook it down a bit, it's going to add that sweetness just to balance out the other spicier or more savory flavors. But depending what you're in the mood for, onions got your back. To peel my garlic cloves, there's a little bit of onion juice on my cutting board, so it's sticking a little bit, but I promise it usually works really smoothly. To peel your garlic cloves, you can just give them a tap with your knife and the peel comes right off. And for the for the garlic, I'm actually going to use the slightly smaller holes just because it's a smaller object and it's a little bit easier to do it on those ones. Same with your garlic as with your onion. When your fingers get a little bit too close, just throw it on the cutting board, give it a chop.
And save your fingers.
Yeah, absolutely. Fingers are so much more important than your garlic. And garlic turns into a little paste, just like our onion. With garlic, the chemical that actually makes it taste like garlic is called allicin. And the more that you chop or grate or smash your garlic, the more garlicky it tastes because it activates that chemical more. So if you're looking for something that tastes extra garlicky, you can go ahead and grate it or chop it really finely. If you're looking for something with just a whisper of garlic, then you don't have to be so thorough. You can just do a larger mince, or you can just leave your clove whole. Garlic and herbs are also a really good way to add flavor to any sort of dish, regardless of what you're making, especially if you're trying to use less salt, or maybe you don't have a whole lot of spices on hand. I think that herbs and garlic, even citrus, so like the lemon that we'll be adding at the end, give really nice flavor and make everything taste fresh. So maybe if you're using canned vegetables, like what we had in our pantry kit this week, or if you're using frozen vegetables, it really brightens everything up and makes it taste fresh regardless of where it's coming from. Mauricio, how much do you like garlic?
I feel like I do like garlic. I feel like when you add too much garlic, the flavor can be intense. But yeah, I definitely like a little bit of garlic in my food. It definitely, as you said, it adds some flavor. It's instead of using salt, garlic is also healthier as well. So yeah, I feel like I do enjoy garlic in my food. But yeah, if there's a little too much in there, then it can be intense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I've heard of like many health benefits of garlic as well. I've heard of a lot of people who kind of just, if they're able to, they kind of bite it raw and they can just drink some water along with it. And I've heard that it could give off many health benefits as well that way.
Yeah. My dad likes to do that, Mauricio. But what he'll do is, regardless of what he's cooking, he'll make a garlic paste and right at the end, put that garlic paste in. So everything he cooks tastes super garlicky, which if you like it, it's a great approach. I certainly do, but it desensitizes me. So after I eat his cooking for a couple days, then everything else just tastes kind of plain by comparison because everything he makes is so intensely garlicky, which, you know, there are pros and cons.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, yeah. I feel like if I would have like too much garlic too, I feel like everything else, it would definitely taste bland because garlic, its flavor is just super intense.
Okay, so the recipe called for 4 to 6 cloves. I had a couple bigger cloves, so I'm gonna hold off with just the 4, and we're gonna start building the next part of our recipe. And just a heads up, we're gonna put this into the oven. It might not come out by the end of class, but we'll let you know you have that recipe. And before we depart, I'll let you know what to look for to know that it's done. So I turn my flame on medium and I start heating that same pan that I used to sear the chicken. If you have a pan like cast iron or stainless steel that doesn't have any plastic on, that's the pan you want to use because you can build your dish directly on the stove and then put it into the oven. I didn't have one that really suited that purpose, so I'm building it in here and then I'll transfer it to another dish before I bake, but it works just as well. And right here, there's not too much oil there in the bottom, so I might add a touch more before I add my onion. And I mentioned before that fat is flavor. So imagine olive oil, for example. Olive oil has a distinct flavor, and olive oil is also a fat. What's nice about using a neutral oil, like the canola oil or vegetable, grapeseed, rice bran, all sorts of options, they don't have much flavor, which means you can infuse them. So I added a little bit of neutral oil here, and I'm going to infuse it with the flavor from my garlic and onions. And then later, I'll show you how to do that with spices as well. Okay, seeing a little bit of sizzle, so I'm going to go ahead and add these. Using the onion juice here to scrape up some of the browning from the bottom. As long as your the schmutz on the bottom of your pan, it's called souks actually. That's the proper culinary term. But as long as those little pieces on the bottom of your pan aren't black, those are going to be great to include. If it did start smoking at any point or it got a little too dark, then you can just rinse your pan out and start from there. No harm, no foul. But I'm kind of lazy. I don't like doing as many dishes as necessary if you're using a bunch of different pans. So I like to use the same one if I can. It's not lazy, it's strategic, I like to tell myself. And what's happening here is the onion juice is steaming the souks off the bottom of the pan, which is really useful. Even if you just had a really dirty pan, you could throw some water in there, and the term is deglazing. It would deglaze, and the brown bits would be picked up into the water, and you can easily clean your dishes. Because we all know that soaking is a lie. It's just an excuse to not do your dishes, which I'm not above it. And look at how clean my pan is now. So just using that onion and garlic alone picked up all of that flavor. I'm going to turn up my heat a little bit just because I want to evaporate some of that liquid and concentrate the sugars of the onions. Like I said, we're using the onions to add a bit of sweetness as opposed to any sort of spice, which means that we want to cook it down a bit. The less you cook it, the spicier it'll be. Adding a pinch of salt here as well. Just like with our chicken that we seasoned before we seared, we want to season our veggies as they go in as well. And as our onion cooks there, I'm going to tear my mustard greens just so it's ready to go. Move some of this garlic off of here. Okay, so destemming any leafy green is really simple. You just hold it at the bottom with one hand and I underestimated my own strength. You hold it at the base of the stem, and with your other hand, you kind of run it through. And depending on the strength of the stem, as soon as it gets a little bit weaker, it'll typically break, which is fine because that's how you know that it's tender enough to eat without being too fibrous. Whereas the bottom parts down here, they're pretty thick, so I don't plan on eating those. And we can do that with our entire bunch of mustard greens. So hold at the bottom and tear to the top until your stem breaks. This week we got mustard greens in the kit, which means that that's what we're using. But next week, if you got kale, if you got spinach, you could use all of those. The only thing I'd add is that certain greens like collards, kale, mustard, they all have a bit more structure to them. So they're not going to cook down like spinach will. Spinach, you have to use a lot of it to get the same level of green and distribution throughout your dish, just because it cooks down because it has a really high water content. And that's fine. If you really like spinach, go ahead and use spinach. You just might need to use more than one bunch. This is also a great opportunity to use greens that are slightly wilty. So some of mine, they've seen better days, which is fine. These are going into a braised dish, so they're going to cook for a long time in the oven. They're going to get wilty anyway, so they basically just have a head start. Okay, so I've destemmed all of my greens. And this doesn't have to be perfect. You can this is a great way, cannot emphasize enough, to get your children involved in the kitchen if you've got them. Because you can just tear them up, tear them into smaller pieces. I'm going to run my knife through just because it's going to be a little bit quicker. But that's one of my favorite activities to include in any of our recipes for families classes or for kids classes, because there are so many ways to cook without using a knife or without using a stove, and tearing greens is a great way to do that. So I'm just going in both directions, once horizontally, once vertically, so I can get little pieces of greens. No one wants an overwhelming amount. Okay, so my onions are starting to brown themselves. That's a good sign. That means that the sugars in those onions are caramelizing and they're sweetening up in flavor. This is a good lesson as well. So if your onions start to stick or start to get a little browner than you'd like, all you have to do is add a little bit of water. I have my chicken broth here, so you can always use that since we've got it ready for the recipe anyway. But I'm going to go ahead and use a splash of water. You splash that water in, and just like the onion juice did before, you scrape up all of the brown bits from the bottom. We end up getting kind of a caramelized or sweeter element to them. And those can continue to cook. And the next step is to add our spaghetti. Today we're using whole wheat spaghetti, and the recipe calls for 8 ounces just because there are other things going on in this dish. So we don't need pasta to be the main event. 8 ounces is about half of any standard size pack of spaghetti. And what we can do with this is break it into about 1-inch pieces as they go in. That's traditional of this dish. You can even buy noodles specifically for this purpose. They're super cheap. You can find them in basically any store in the Hispanic section. This is a fun one too, having your kiddos break these into pieces. Who am I kidding? Having me break them into pieces. This is a blast. And the reason we put our noodles in at this point is to toast them on the bottom of the pan before we start adding the spices and tomatoes and whatnot. And it's okay if they're not perfectly uniform. It's going to give a little bit difference of texture as we cook, which I particularly enjoy. Okay, another good opportunity to add a little bit more oil so we can toast it evenly. Just stir our noodles up. If you're using standard spaghetti, then you'll notice that it gets more brown as you toast it. Gives it an element of nuttiness. But since these whole wheat noodles are already brown, you may have gathered, hard to use that indicator. So just give it a minute or two. Let it toast. You might smell a difference after a minute or two. But even if not, a little bit of time in the pan before we add the liquid is always welcome. Now I'm going to leave a little hole there in the middle. It's kind of like a cute little nest so we can bloom our spices. Okay, so here we are. I'm adding a bit of oil to the middle of the pan here. Then I'm adding 1 more tablespoon of paprika. If you have any other chili powder that you really enjoy, you could definitely use that too. This dish doesn't have to be made with paprika, but it's what I got on hand, so it's what I'm using. Ooh, that smells so yummy. And the paprika will infuse that oil and start to brown really quickly. So you actually want to be careful at this point. You don't want to burn it. As soon as you give that paprika about 45 seconds to a minute in the oil, then you can go ahead and add your tomatoes. The recipe calls for 15 ounces of tomatoes and about 2 cups of liquid, but for us, we can just go ahead and use this whole can, which is about 24 ounces, and we'll just use a little bit less liquid. And in order not to waste, I'm going to fill my pan with some water to get the rest of that tomato. And we're stirring. There's still some brown on the bottom of the pan. So just like before, scraping that up, bringing this to a simmer. This is already smelling delicious. And you guessed it, adding a pinch of salt at this point as well, seasoning along the way. Then we're adding our mustard green. So regardless of what green you're using, it's going to wilt down a bunch. So it might look like we have so much going on, and we do. We have kind of a lot going on, but it'll wilt down and the ratio will be just right. And I'm noticing as I do this that my sauce in the bottom is pretty thick. That's really good because we want our sauce to thicken as it cooks. But when it's in the oven, it's going to continue to thicken because all of that liquid, like the water, or if you're using vegetable or chicken broth, will evaporate. So I actually want there to be a bit more moisture. So I'm going to go ahead and add some more water here. Just because it'll help our chicken cook as well. And you can see already that we have so much less green than we did about 30 seconds ago. Not to say I told you so, but I told you so. Okay, and you can see it really saucy, looking really good in there. I'm going to add a bit more liquid one last time. And I'm going to go ahead and use this Dutch oven here to finish my dish in the oven. And the way I'm going to do that is by making sure that all of those brown bits are scraped off the bottom. Then as soon as this is at a simmer, I'm also going to preheat my Dutch oven a bit, just because ovens are really great at maintaining a temperature, but they take a long time to get ingredients up to that temperature. So if we can give it a kickstart by heating it on the stove, then the cooking process in the oven will go much more quickly. Okay, and now's a good opportunity. You don't want to taste your raw noodles, but you do want to taste your sauce. Wow, mine is delicious. It doesn't call for it, but I'm gonna throw some black pepper in there just because I love black pepper. Add another pinch of salt. Then I'm gonna go ahead and transfer that into my Dutch oven. There's one thing I love more than making the dish the first time around, and that's eating leftovers, because all of the hard work is already done. You just gotta warm it up and enjoy. So this dish is going to make plenty for the first time around, probably for about 4 to 6 people, and it makes a ton for the second time around. So if there are only 2 of you in the house, then you might get a couple rounds out of it. Okay, and right here I've added all of the contents to the Dutch oven. Now I'm just going to nestle my chicken in and put that in the oven. So my chicken actually I have my tongs here. Nestling my chicken in. I'm leaving the most brown parts above the liquid, but there's plenty in there. So what's going to happen is the noodles are going to absorb a bunch of that liquid. The chicken is going to steam in the bottom. So the bottom of the chicken will steam to cook through to the center in that liquid as well. And all of that chicken juice should go in. But if at any point in the oven it starts to look a little too dry, then you can always add another splash of liquid. So right here, I'm starting to see some bubbles, which is great, because that means when I put it into the oven, it's immediately going to start cooking. So you can see what it looks like here just before it goes into the oven. We have the tomatoey base with our noodles, mustard greens, onions, garlic, paprika, chicken nestled in there, Now, I'm going to put that uncovered into the oven, and it should be done in about 20 or so minutes. So once you build it on the stove, it happens really quickly, especially in a 400-degree oven, because we want that liquid to evaporate, and it's going to end up being like a saucy, noodly dish. So this is getting tucked in. You'll know it's done when it gets sort of dry on top. You should see the noodles kind of peeking out because they will have absorbed all of that liquid and they'll be tender and luscious. It might even form a little bit of a crust on top and it might get extra brown up there. Those are great signs. Good to see that because then you have a bit more texture, whereas it's going to be a little bit softer underneath. So I highly recommend if you can get that browning on top, you won't regret it. But otherwise, you just want to cook it until the chicken reaches about 165 or 175 internal temperature and your noodles are soft. So with that, thank you so much for hanging out. I hope you all get a chance to make this dish. I can't wait to see you next week.